Welcome to YouTube Comments today with another video, and today guys, the video is going to be where to hand trap, and I do hope that you enjoyed today's video because there's going to be a lot to talk about with the current format. If you haven't already checked out my sponsors over on Gem, Cloud, Arla, Imperium, Dragonshield, RW, MainPhaze, and Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so all down below in the description. Also go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so we can hit our goal at 30,000. I'd really appreciate it. Now without further ado, let's hop right into where to hand trap. The first thing I have for today is going to be Pure Mitsu. Pure Mitsu is still a deck that we see here and there. It's not super popular, but it's something that you do see. I do like the ability to have something like DD Crow or Bestial to be able to banish a Mitsurugi from grave when it's tributed for cost. Let's say your opponent goes Prayer's Tribute, and then you can go ahead and just banish it, right? So you don't have to worry about it coming back. Can activate because it's in a new location. If you have Bell, you can always Bell the names from coming back, but I would always rather just Bell pre-prep. I think pre-prep is the most degenerate thing that we have right now for the deck. One thing that I've talked about before with my friends about getting banned from the deck is just Mitsurugi Mirror, so that your opponent can't play pre-prep, which is pretty cool. That's another way to go ahead and hit the deck without really hitting the deck fully, which I think is pretty productive as well. Same with Impulse onto the Ritual, of course. This is going to be one of the best things that you can do. Now, when your opponent goes Habakiri, you don't want to stop the Habakiri, you want to stop the Saji, so you'll go ahead and Ash Saji. One card that I'm surprised that we didn't see more of when Pure Mitsu was really popular was Skullmeister, because it's essentially Ash 4, 5, 6 in this case, and that's something that you're going to be seeing happening a lot in that matchup, so it's a really good card to have against this, because the second the Saji tries to activate in the graveyard, you can go ahead and Skullmeister the same way that you would Ash, and then you stop your opponent from getting to the Ritual, which is obviously the most important thing to do here. Valor, Imperm, Nib, all very lackluster cards. You don't really want against this matchup. I'd be signing those out immediately. You don't want those like at all. Now, if you're playing against a really bad Mitsurugi player and they're playing like Futsu and everything, and they're like really extending hard, they're tributing the Futsu, they're tributing the Mirakumo, they're tributing the Habakiri, and they have everything left on their board, and you Nibiru them, that's where it's really good. But if you're playing on somebody who just like knows what they're doing, right? They're just not tributing their Mirakumo or they're not tributing their Futsu, so if they do get Nibiru'd, then they don't really care, right? Now, if you have like Nibiru plus Meister or Nibiru plus Bell or Nibiru plus Crow, right? These are going to be the things that matter a lot more, because at that point you can at least clear the body fully. At least if that's like their last one, right? They like save the Futsu on board and then you Nibiru and they try to bring it back and you're just like, no, right? So it just stays in the grave and then you force the prayers to bring it back, right? Which is going to be more ideal. But more times than not, we're not relying on our opponent being worse. We're trying to play more optimally, so I wouldn't be trying to play things like Valor and Imperm Nibiru against this matchup. Next up, we have Yummy. This is Pure Yummy. One of the biggest things that I want to make sure is clear, if you open Ash Bell, I like this a lot, and this is something that I'm trying to do 9 times out of 10. If you open Ash Bell, you should just win that game on the spot. If your opponent summons Cups Yummy away, you Ash, they go to tag out, you Bell. They better have Surprise, they better have like Marshmallow, right? Because at that point, it's just turn over, right? And that's something that you really should think about. I think this is the strongest combination of hand traps into this matchup. Impulse for the returns of the Synchro. Impulse is usually better in this matchup paired up. So if you have like a Valor and Impermanent Impulse, or you have like a DD Crow and Impulse, right? Something of that matter. Impulse is the same thing as having like Ash Bell. You can have like Ash Impulse, right? It's still really strong too, but they have to have something still on the board. Usually they will, but maybe they won't. So you got to be careful about that too. Valor Imperm always just goes to the Cupsy, unless your opponent makes Cupsy Yummy away with non-Yummies, like they can't reborn anything, right? That happens sometimes with like the Striker cards. Nibiru is always going to be dropped right on the Metal Marcher line before your opponent can get to a Herald of the Arclight. And then DD Crow or a Bestial can answer whenever your opponent uses Mignon to try to bring back a monster. You go ahead and just get rid of it, so you force your opponent to have the additional extender. Now, as for Yummy Mitsu, it's going to be a bit of the same, a bit different. So on the tribute effects to the grave, like your opponent goes tribute a Mirakumo for prayers for cost, then you Crow it so it's in a new location and it can't activate. That's your best spot for DD Crow. You can hit Mignon if they start heavy on like their Yummy cards and you want to knock them off that engine, but a lot of times I'm going for like the rituals. Nibiru stays the same, Bell stays the same, Impulse and Valor Imperm stay the same, but Ash is a little different. My main priority, and this is depending on what deck you're playing, right? If you want to deal with the Mitsu cards or if you want to deal with the Yummy cards. A lot of times I just don't want to deal with the Mitsu cards because that means great purification and other things that I just don't want to deal with, right? So if your opponent goes Habakiri to Usaji, you're just ashing that. I think that's the #1 priority. But if your opponent is going for like their Cups Yummy way play and you have like Ash Impulse or Ash Bell, you can do the play that we just talked about, where you can just clear this all day long, because a lot of times if they start with a Yummy line, then they're trying to get to the Herald to get to the Mitsurugi cards, and they play a thinner Yummy package, so if you go ahead and clear this early, then your opponent's not really going to have a great way to combo back into the game unless they open both engines, right? The last thing that you can do is just allow your opponent to full Yummy combo, and the second they link off the Herald, you just ash the Herald to cut them off from the Mitsurugi cards, which is also very effective. You kind of have to read what your opponent's doing and what you'd rather deal with, but these are 3 individual choke points that are all very meaningful in their own regard. Now, as for Draco Tail, you're always just going to want to use DD Crow on the Urgula target, because the Urgula will go back to deck, and then you'll banish the Femina, which is the usual target, which is really nice to have here. Bell and Ash are usually going after the trap cards. You can hit like the K2 or the Rahu, but a lot of times it's going to be a defensive use of these cards. If you're going first, then you can start hitting the spell cards with Ash. And if you're going second, you're always going after the trap cards with Ash and Bell. It just helps you play through the board. These are honestly the best cards you can have going second. Bell should be in your side deck right now. There's no reason it's not. Impulse can hit any of the spells. It can even hit the K2 because of the fact that it includes the effect of Special Summon, which is really nice. You really just gotta gauge, again, on like what you're more afraid of, right? If they start Branded Fusion, I'm just hitting Branded Fusion, right? Like, that's just gonna happen. But at that point, it really depends, because you could also save Impulse if they try to, like, Femina, but they have to have a card on board, so it can't be during your turn. It has to be during their turn that you're hitting them with the Impulse. So it really depends on, like, what you're more afraid of. If I'm going first, then I'm probably just saving it for, like, a K2 or Rahu, right? But if I'm going second, I'm probably saving the Impulse for the Femina, because I feel like that matters a lot more whenever I'm trying to protect my own board, right? I know a lot of people were like, well, you shouldn't hit the Lucius because if they have Femina, but like, here's the thing. Have the 33% chance of actually opening up the Femina. If my opponent normal summons a Lucius or they normal summon the Malulu, I'm hitting either of them with Valor Imperm, because at that point, I'm just putting my opponent on better habit. If you're hitting the Arthalion, it just feels a lot weaker, because your opponent's still sending cards to the grave, and they're still getting sets of Rahus and Ketus, right? So it feels like you're not really doing as much as you want to. I'm trying to cut my opponent off as early as possible from everything. So I'm not even going to give my opponent the opportunity to add a Femina, because that means that your Valor Imperm is even worse. Because if they do add Femina, right, then at that point you're like, well, if they have like a Rahu or something, and they use that first, then my Valor Imperm has always been dead. So I'm just using it immediately. Now for Maliss, nothing has really ever changed from this matchup. Everything's been pretty standard. Nibiru is pretty good in general. If they go for the Akkode line, you can just like slam Nib on Akkode, and then it's really awkward for your opponent because they can't summon more that turn, right? So they have to rely on reborning things like Binder. So if you have the Bell to stop the Bestial, or like a Hair, or if you have Ash to just keep the Binder banished, or like Impulse to keep the Binder banished, right? That's going to be your best spot. Bell is really good onto the field spell to just cut your opponent off immediately, but you can hit the Binder when it hits the board to try to banish cards in the grave, which is definitely very effective, so you don't have to worry about your cards getting banished or your opponent having more extenders that they can just like banish into. Ash or Impulse do work on Binder, but if my opponent normal summons Chesty Cat, that's like the first thing that they do. It's getting Ash Imperm or Veilered. I'm not allowing my opponent to do more than that. A lot of times, if your opponent has like Dormouse and Chessie, they're going to greed in some of the Chessie, which is crazy, because if they don't open Hair or Bestial, they're in a really bad spot. So if they normal summon the Chessie, I'm hitting that 10 out of 10 times, plus I'm just never letting my opponent draw 2 plus extender, right? So hitting Chessie is definitely very correct. But if they start with Chessie or Dormouse, I'm just going to go ahead and Valor Imperm. If it's White Rabbit, I'd probably be pretty apprehensive to go ahead and just Valor Imperm. You definitely can, but I feel like the punish of a Bestial or a March Hare is a lot worse on something like a White Rabbit than it would on a Chessie or a Dormouse, because those effects really do matter when they go off. Having the set of the trap card is like less important in my opinion. So that's something too where like if they don't have the Firewall co-linked underneath the Akkode when they go to make it, because it's a usual turn 1 board, you can just Valor Imperm that at the end of the turn when they try to go for that, and then a lot of times your Valor Imperm is still a lot more meaningful, but hitting a White Rabbit just feels a lot worse than hitting a Chessie or a Dormouse and eliminating that effect for the turn. K9VS, you're definitely wanting to stop a Rosin. If they summon it, you can Ash it, but I'm stopping Naroi. If I have Ash, Impulse, Valor, Imperm, I'm hitting Naroi. A lot of times, if your opponent normal summons Naroi, it resolves and they use Naroi to look at your hand, you might just scoop, right? And that happens more than not, because at that point, you don't want your opponent to get free advantage. It's game one, right? You don't want them to see what you're on, especially if you don't think that you're going to be able to crack the full board. And if they resolve Naroi, they're getting to full board, right? They are going to do that. So I'm going to stop Naroi as much as possible. I do not want them to be able to extend further. I'm going to put them on better have the extender, right? The deck is hurt, but it still is very consistent, but it can also brick pretty bad. Bell onto Lupus or the Rock add back, same with DD Crow. This has been pretty standard, and these are just the common targets for you, especially if they start heavy on like the Vanquishal side. You just don't want them to get back to attributes. As for Lunalight, if my opponent uses Yellow Marten and Grave, I'm just going to go ahead and DD Crow that out of the grave so my opponent doesn't get that as an opportunity. But you can also DD Crow the Leo Dancer just so your opponent doesn't have that as material to banish off like the Wolf or the Masquerade. To go for the Liger Dancer, that card is still very scary, and if you can get rid of the Leo immediately, it's a lot harder for your opponent to make that. Speaking about the Masquerade and Wolf, if you have Ogre or Bell, these both work in this scenario to go ahead and stop these cards from being Miracle Fusions. Both very strong in their own regard, and you want to make sure that they don't resolve. Ash onto the Silverhound or Impulse on a Silverhound so your opponent can't extend further. And then the Heavy Poly can get Impulse, and that's something that you definitely want to Impulse. If you're going first and they drop Heavy Poly, you want to stop this, because otherwise you're going to have a really rough time. Then Valor Imperm onto Gold Leo is usually a pass turn unless they have a very good hand. I hope they enjoyed today's video. If you haven't already checked my Twitter, Twitch, Discord, Instagram, or subscribed to the channel yet, definitely go ahead and do so. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'll catch you on the next video. Thank you.